Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be tackling something that might surprise some people. We're diving deep into pica in adults with autism.
Okay.
We've got some excerpts from Cheap ABA to guide us. And while their material is great, but it's often geared towards caregivers. But we're going to unpack what's most useful for you, the listener, whether you're personally experiencing pica or supporting someone who is.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting? Pica is often thought of as just a childhood thing,
Oh, yes.
like something that kids just eventually grow out of.
Right, right.
But the reality is that it can absolutely persist into adulthood, and understanding why is crucial for finding effective solutions, you know?
Absolutely. Maybe this will sound familiar to some of you out there listening.
hmm
I remember back in college, I had this just inexplicable craving for chalk.
Oh,
Not eating it, thankfully,
okay.
but I was just obsessed with the feel of it, the smell,
hmm
the way it squeaked on the blackboard. I'd spend hours just doodling in my notebook just to experience those sensations.
That's a great illustration of how we all seek out like specific sensory input.
Right.
And, you know, for some autistic adults, that drive to experience certain sensations can manifest as pica, where those unique sensory experiences are found in non-food items.
Right.
But before we jump into the why, let's define what we're talking about here.
Okay, so let's get specific. What exactly is pica? We're not just talking about picky eaters here, right?
Definitely not. Pica goes beyond like simple food preferences.
Okay.
It's the persistent consumption of substances that have no nutritional value.
Right.
Think dirt, paper, metal,
Oh, wow.
even things like soap or paint.
Wow, okay, that's definitely a bit more intense than my chalk fascination.
Yeah.
So why is this something we see in autistic adults in particular?
Well, it's multifaceted, as with most things related to autism, and to really understand it, we need to consider the individual's unique experiences and needs.
Okay.
One major factor that's often discussed is sensory seeking, but even that has layers to it.
Okay, so let's peel back those layers. When we say sensory seeking, what does that actually mean in this context?
It's about understanding that we all have sensory preferences, but for some autistic individuals, those preferences can be much more intense or specific.
Right.
And sometimes non-food items provide those unique sensory experiences that they crave.
Right.
It could be the texture of dirt, the smoothness of a stone, or even the taste of something like metal.
So it's not about being weird or childish. It's about fulfilling a very real sensory need.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that those sensory experiences serve a purpose for the individual. They might be seeking stimulation or calming, or even a way to regulate their emotions.
My chalk obsession definitely had a calming effect on me. I would get lost in the repetitive motions, the sensory input, and it would just kind of quiet my mind.
That makes sense. And, you know, for some individuals, the act of chewing or sucking itself can be incredibly soothing. It's not just babies who find comfort in those actions.
Right.
Think about how many people chew gum or bite their nails when they're stressed.
Yeah, it's almost like a self-regulation technique.
Exactly. And for some autistic adults, those oral fixations might extend to non-food items. It's a way to manage anxiety, sensory overload, or even just the general stresses of daily life.
So we've talked about sensory seeking and oral fixation. But are there other potential causes we need to consider? The Cheap ABA website mentions a few others, right?
Right. It's important to remember that pica is rarely caused by just one thing. It's often a combination of factors. For example, some research suggests that nutritional deficiencies could play a role in some cases.
Interesting. So it's not always about the sensory experience or the act of chewing.
Right.
There could be a biological component as well.
Exactly. And in some cases, pica might even be a learned behavior.
Mm.
If someone sees a family member or peer engaging in pica, they might imitate that behavior, especially if they're struggling to communicate their needs in other ways.
Oh, so that highlights the importance of understanding the individual's specific circumstances and history, right?
Absolutely. It's not about making assumptions or jumping to conclusions. It's about gathering information, observing behaviors, and really trying to understand what's driving those actions.
So how do we move from understanding to actually helping? Because knowing why something happens doesn't automatically solve the problem, right?
Right. Understanding is just the first step. Then comes the crucial part, figuring out effective management strategies.
Okay.
And thankfully, the Cheap ABA website provides some really valuable insights in that area. One approach they emphasize is sensory substitutes.
Ah, so instead of trying to completely eliminate the desire for those unique sensations, we try to redirect it towards safer and more appropriate alternatives.
Exactly. And when we're thinking about sensory substitutes, it's crucial to get specific. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. What works for one person might not work for another.
Hmm.
Remember how you mentioned your talk obsession? You were drawn to the feel, the smell, the sound?
Yeah, it was whole sensory experience.
Right. So if we were trying to find sensory substitutes for you, we'd need to consider all those elements. Maybe it's something with a similar texture, like modeling clay or kinetic sand.
Okay.
Or maybe it's about finding other ways to engage that auditory sense, like listening to ASMR or playing with instruments.
So it's about getting creative and really thinking outside the box
Yes.
to find solutions that actually align with the individual's specific needs.
Exactly. And, that's where professional guidance can be incredibly helpful.
Okay.
Speech language pathologists, occupational therapists,
Right.
they can all play a crucial role in assessing sensory needs and developing personalized intervention strategies.
So it's not just about fixing pica. It's about understanding the underlying needs and finding ways to meet them in a healthy and fulfilling way.
Precisely. It's about empowering individuals to manage their own sensory experiences and make choices that support their well-being.
Well, I'm definitely feeling more empowered just from this conversation. But I'm also realizing that there's so much more to explore. Like, how do we actually implement these sensory substitutes in a practical way? And what about those other management strategies mentioned in the Cheap ABA material?
Those are great questions, and we're definitely going to dive deeper into those topics in the next part of our deep dive. We'll be exploring environmental control, the role of professional guidance, and some additional tips for supporting both yourself and others.
This is getting really interesting. I can't wait to unpack those strategies and see how they can be applied in real-life situations. But for now, let's take a quick pause and come back fresh for part 2, where we'll continue our exploration of pica in autistic adults.
Welcome back to our deep dive into pica in autistic adults. Before we left off, we were discussing the importance of understanding the sensory needs that often underlie this behavior.
Yeah, we were talking about sensory substitutes,
Right.
finding those safe and enjoyable alternatives
Yes,
to those non-food items that might be attracting someone with pica.
exactly. And one thing I want to emphasize is the importance of mashing the substitute to the specific sensory input that's being thought. If someone is drawn to the texture of dirt,
Mhm.
for example, simply giving them a stress ball might not be helpful.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's not just about providing any kind of sensory input. It's about finding a substitute that actually addresses that specific craving.
Precisely. So let's say someone is chewing on pencils because they enjoy the pressure and resistance against their teeth.
Okay.
In that case, a chewy toy or a silicone straw might be a more effective substitute than something soft or swishy.
Okay. I'm starting to see how this requires a lot of observation and careful consideration. It's not as simple as just swapping out one item for another.
Absolutely. And this is where collaboration with the individual is so crucial.
Okay.
If you're working with someone who has pica, involving them in the process of choosing substitutes can make a world of difference.
So instead of saying, here, chew on this instead,
Right.
it's more about saying, let's explore some different options together and see what feels good to you.
Exactly. It's about empowering them to make choices that align with their own sensory preferences. And it's also a great opportunity to build trust and rapport.
That reminds me of my chalk obsession in college. It wasn't just about the sensory experience, it was also about feeling in control. I could choose the color, the pressure, the way I moved the chalk across the board. It gave me a sense of agency.
I think that's a really important point. It's not just about the sensory input itself. It's also about the individual sense of control and autonomy. And, when we talk about management strategies for pica, environmental control is another crucial element.
Okay, so we're shifting gears a bit here. What does environmental control look like in this context?
It's about making thoughtful changes to the environment to reduce temptation and make it easier for the individual to make healthy choices.
That sounds almost too simple. Can you give us some specific examples?
Sure. Let's say someone is drawn to eating paper. A simple environmental control strategy would be to keep paper products out of reach
Okay.
or in closed containers.
Okay. So it's about reducing access to those tempting items. Makes
Yeah.
sense.
Right. Or let's say someone is attracted to the texture of certain fabrics. You might replace those fabrics with alternatives that are less appealing, or you might provide safe and acceptable items with similar textures.
I'm starting to see how this can be a really proactive approach. It's not just about reacting to pica behaviors. It's about creating an environment that supports healthy choices from the get-go.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that environmental control can also tap into the autistic strength of systematizing. Many artistic individuals thrive on routines and predictability, so
Yeah.
creating a structured environment with clear boundaries can actually be a source of comfort and stability.
I love that. We're turning a potential challenge into a positive by leveraging those inherent strengths.
Absolutely. And this also highlights why it's so important to work with professionals who understand autism and can tailor their approach to the individual's specific needs.
Right. The cheap ABA material emphasizes professional guidance quite a bit.
Yeah.
What types of professionals are we talking about here, and how can they actually help?
Well, there's a whole team of experts who can be incredibly valuable in addressing pica. Speech-language pathologists can help assess communication needs and develop strategies for expressing those needs in a more functional way. Occupational therapists can address sensory processing issues and recommend specific sensory activities or tools. And behavior analysts can develop individualized behavior plans that focus on positive reinforcement and skill building.
Wow, so it's really a multidisciplinary approach.
It is, and it's important to remember that there's no shame in seeking professional support. In fact, it's often the best way to get personalized guidance and access evidence-based interventions. Remember, you don't have to navigate this alone.
That's a really reassuring message. And speaking of not navigating this alone, I'm curious to hear from our listeners. If you're dealing with pica, whether personally or as a caregiver, what are some of the challenges you're facing?
Yeah.
What questions do you have about these management strategies?
Share your thoughts in the comments, and we'll do our best to address them in the next part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into pica in autistic adults. And, we've covered a lot of ground,
Yeah, we have.
from understanding those underlying sensory needs to exploring those practical management strategies like sensory substitutes and environmental control.
Right, and we've emphasized the importance of seeking professional guidance and collaborating with the individual to find solutions that actually work for them.
Right, because at the end of the day, it's about empowering individuals to manage their own sensory experiences and make choices that support their well-being. But, as we've been diving deep into this topic, I've been thinking about the bigger picture.
Oh, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, we've talked about how pica is often a way for autistic individuals to meet their sensory needs, right?
Right.
But what if our society as a whole was better at providing healthy and accessible sensory outlets for everyone, not just those with pica?
That's a really fascinating thought. Are you suggesting that by creating environments that are more inclusive of diverse sensory needs, we could potentially prevent some of these challenging behaviors from developing in the first place?
Exactly. It's not just about treating pica. It's about fostering a culture of sensory awareness and acceptance. Think about it. We're constantly bombarded with visual and auditory stimuli.
Right.
But what about our other senses? Touch, smell, even proprioception, the sense of our body's position in space.
You're right, we often neglect those other senses, and that can be especially challenging for individuals who are hypersensitive or hyposensitive to certain sensory inputs.
Maybe we need more sensory gardens, more spaces where it's okay to stim, more opportunities to explore different textures and sensations without judgments.
And I love that idea. Imagine a world where we're all more attuned to our sensory needs and more respectful of other sensory preferences. We could design classrooms, workplaces, even public spaces with sensory diversity in mind.
And it wouldn't just benefit those on the autism spectrum, it could benefit everyone. Think about people with anxiety disorders, sensory processing disorder, even just those who are easily overwhelmed by noise or crowds.
It's about recognizing that sensory differences are not deficits. They're just part of the beautiful diversity of human experience. And when we embrace that diversity, we all win.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And that brings me back to my own experience with chalk. What started as a quirky obsession actually taught me a lot about the power of sensory input and how it can impact our behavior in ways we might not even realize.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we all have our quirks and our ways of seeking comfort and stimulation. The key is to find outlets that are safe, healthy, and fulfilling.
And to create a world where those outlets are readily available to everyone, regardless of their sensory needs or neurodiversity.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into pica and autism. We hope you've gained some valuable insights and maybe even some inspiration to explore your own sensory world and advocate for a more sensory-inclusive society. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.